We have finally finished our LEGO Pirate World, complete with a newly added harbor, the fortress and volcano all placed together. Then we've also added a ton of motion to the model with different little motorized scenes. And of course, when everything is completed, the volcano erupts as well. But before we now expand the existing pirate MOC in the second part of the video, it's time to start at the very beginning with the first little island. What I'm starting off with is actually not the island itself, but more the water surrounding the island. Therefore you can see the base layer of the water gradually getting lighter towards the island, on which now the water is being placed first of all with the waves surrounding the island, and then the rest simply has to be covered in trans light blue tiles. Once again, this is the most repetitive work you can possibly do when building LEGO. Therefore, for the other 5 water base plates I'm going to build in the next minutes, a few friends of mine are going to help me with that work, because otherwise I would have completely lost my mind building that. But first of all, let's start with the island itself. This is the basic building technique. I'm using cut plates around the island as a sort of shoreline, and this then allows me to have the island begin at an angle and not have these small steps you would have otherwise gotten when using normal plates. For the center of the island, well, what should I tell you? This is now a completely insane building technique. I've chosen to use these LEGO net pieces, and this building technique now consists of using a normal plate with a stud underneath, and this stud is now being placed through one of these squares of the net, and now on the back side once again we have to connect that with another stud. So in order to fill up one of these little squares of the net, it takes 3 LEGO pieces. You can now probably imagine how time consuming and also expensive this entire net is to cover up, and what the basic idea of this net building technique is now to have a path leading towards the center of the island, covering 3 of these nets. I'm for sure not going to build the entire island out of this absolutely stupid building technique, but it's also sort of satisfying once you've completed this path, because it's the most flexible LEGO build you could possibly create, and therefore you can of course also achieve new shapes and new surfaces that would have otherwise been completely impossible. These nets are now being connected using studs at the edges, and in the middle you can see me gradually work my way up towards the center of the island, which is of course a bit higher elevated than the rest of the island on the outside. Of course, all these ugly connecting studs are completely covered using cut plates once again, and this now is what the first section of the path leading towards the center looks like. The rest I've spared you, quite annoying work, and this then is what the shape of the island looks like, which means we can continue with vegetation. And these little pieces right there cost me $1 a piece. These are the old LEGO molds from the palm trees that LEGO used to produce 20 years ago, and it's quite a flexible LEGO piece used to build the trunk. Of course, this square piece at the bottom looks a bit weird, and therefore you can also connect the trunk directly in between 4 studs right there on top of a normal plate. And in order to complete the top of the palm tree, I'm now using a bush, turn that around, and now use these turned around studs to connect the rest of the palm tree on top. Right there for the leaves, I've used these larger plant pieces and then connected it to this algae or seaweed mold. I've then used another of these net pieces to create a hammock in between 2 palm trees, which of course fits perfectly on the little island, which now means we can build the rest of the vegetation and plan the basic structure and layout of the island. One problem I at the moment still have with these palm trees, however, is, there you can see it, it's extremely unstable if you connect it in between 4 studs. So, well, maybe, but I don't even want to mention that, maybe I'm going to glue the bottom of these tree trunks for the exhibition, because I don't want any of these palm trees to then fall over. Then I've experimented with the rest of the layout of the island, where exactly I want to have the different palm trees, and then it was time for some storytelling. First of all, for our little treasure island, there of course has to be a treasure. So I've used one of these little chests right there, and now only used the top of the chest and placed that inside a 1x1 stud gap I left inside that hole, which now looks as if pirates are currently digging out this treasure chest. Of course, a little bit of cheating going on right there, building technique wise. Then, of course, these barrels right there, just like in my Wild West MOC, fit perfectly to that pirate theme. I've used that to build a little raft out of that, bit run down with the sails, you can see that right there, which is now anchored on shore of the island. I've then also placed a few seagulls right there. They simply add so much life. The only problem is that they all have the wings in the exact same position, which then in the end looks a bit stupid, therefore you can't use too many of them. In the center of the island there's another pirate currently carrying barrels around, and then of course more life is added with a little crab right there, 2 dolphins currently jumping out of the water, which now means that we have to continue building the water area. And as I've mentioned earlier, I'm definitely not going to do that completely by myself, because otherwise this is the most repetitive and most annoying work by far. Therefore you can see us starting off with 2 guys working, and then for the next 3 base plates we were 4 people simultaneously building Lego, which was of course the fastest I've ever built Lego. And now 2 of the guys who also helped me build the water base plates also prepared this epic pirate ship. These are Rudy and Willy. They both competed in Lego Masters Germany, and there you can see these absolutely crazy building techniques. All the angles in this ship, you'll see that when we now start to add life to the ship as well. By the way, everything in this pirate ship is completely modular. In the center right there with these grid or net pieces right there, they can be simply detached from the rest of the ship, revealing the interior. The building technique of these grids is also absolutely incredible. It's simply made out of a turned around plate, then connected with 1x1 bricks in this case, in order to achieve this awesome grid effect right there. Really fun building technique. Of course, the anchor of the ship, just as it should be, can also be tucked in. Now the only thing we're not too sure about at the moment is if we should keep this yellow contrast color in the long run. Of course, at the moment the color scheme is heavily inspired by the old Lego pirate ships, but maybe we're going to exchange all the yellow touches around the ship with pearl gold. Back there at the cabin, once again, just take a look at these angles the guys have added. It's absolutely insane building technique wise. Of course, once again, everything is modular. And another thing we actually spent quite some time on designing and planning is whether we should have brick built sails or these sort of paper or fabric sails. But in the end we thought it was much more authentic to have real brick built sails, and therefore they of course are quite heavy but look absolutely incredible, and it's, as I've mentioned earlier, more authentic. Now all these ropes we've attached to the sails and the masts and so on are first of all to stabilize everything and hold the sails in place, but in the end you'll see that right now, as soon as I'm beginning to completely go crazy with the different ropes. And I don't know if it's just me, but I think these 2 hours I've spent connecting Lego strings from one mast and one sail to the other was absolutely worth it. I've really spent some time also researching where these ropes were attached back in the days with real sailing ships. By the way, the longer cords we used were from the old fire trucks from Lego, because they had 50-60 centimeter long cords right there, which was of course perfect. This is what the front of the ship looks like. Absolutely crazy. Once again, I of course can't show you how exactly we've connected this, but just so you know, everything is built using these ball joints on the inside of the ship, which now means, since this is the first section of the Pirate Bay, which is then, by the way, going to be quadrupled in size within the next few months. But this is the first part of the Pirate Bay, which is going to be exhibited on top of the mountain over the next month, and therefore we have to cover up the edge of the entire MOC with simply a black frame. It looks so much cleaner, so much better, and therefore you can now for the first time get a look at what the first section of this MOC looks like. And although at this point this looks somewhat complete, just wait till the end of the video, because this will be completely dominated by the rest of the pirate world. For now, we needed to find a bigger space to continue building, and therefore next up we started to tackle the gap in the back right there. And for that we start off with the cliff for the mainland, where the fortress will be placed on top. We haven't included any transitions for the water this time, as this is a steep coast, so it doesn't really make any sense to indicate shallow water like we did it on the other island. The only thing we did is add some individual waves that roll towards the coast. The rest is once again then simply covered up with these trans light blue tiles. Now we're already getting to the first details. First, I used a small lasso, making the loop tighter so that it now fits on the pin that then holds up the minifigure head. You can already probably guess what I'm going for. This is now anchored underneath this rocky outcrop, and of course this entire scene is heavily inspired by Pirates of the Caribbean. where skeletons are hung up outside underneath the rocks to scare off pirates. We've however also built some more peaceful scenes, like a seagull nesting on a nearby rock right there. But for now, I'd say let's move on to the details on the backside. And now you might wonder how exactly we are going to create details right there, because that's normally simply a clean wall. What we're now going to do is build small scenes in cross sections of the mainland. For example, here's a tunnel or a sort of mine being dug by the pirates, aiming to reach the cave on the other side, which will eventually be the fortress's treasure chamber. And for the treasure chamber itself, we've of course added tons of details, like a bust, the treasure chest in the middle, which is probably even going to be illuminated with LEDs. And also I'll show you how everything is connected to the top and the rest of the fortress in just a second. Around the corner we have the next cave or chamber, and we're continuing with my personal favorite cellar section. These stacked barrels, most likely representing a wine cellar or maybe rum storage, whatever was realistic back in the days. And then in the middle we have a table with a few bottles resting on top. However, I'm most likely going to replace them with green glass for realism. A door closes off the room and leads to the staircase, connecting everything with the fortress once again. There's also currently a guy sampling bottles, and then I added this column in front to make everything a bit cozier and more hidden. Here you can see the mentioned staircase. You can also see it disappearing down there, and then on top it simply comes out. This part is completely modular, eventually being connected with a building that's part of the fortress. To the right of the wine cellar there's a hallway with a small dungeon with skeletons who played cards until they died. Just a little humorous scene right there. And next to it we added a bench in the background that can even be lifted up, although, well, I know this is a bit unnecessary. After having completed all the cross sections and caves, it was time to continue building on top of the mainland. For that I was building it as modular as possible, because in future we're going to light everything up, and therefore this is always quite important. And then it was time to test how everything looks back there, where we at this point still had the gap remaining. So I quickly added the new modules and also worked on the surface structure to prepare all the spaces for the buildings, defensive structures and so on. And to now show you how we built the fortress, let's start with the most important part, the main gate. This now immediately also sets the style for the rest of the entire fortress, with this arch over the entrance, because everything is built very softly and rounded, in contrast to the quite rough cliff face. The main gate of course also needs to be guarded and has an imperial flag hoisted on top, which now leads me to my favorite feature of the gate, because the emblem of the flag we now recreated in brick form with these two crossed cannons to show what type of fortress this is. The walls we built now lead to the first defensive tower, which is also completely round. The building technique in this one is absolutely insane, but on the other side it must be noted that there isn't really much room for an interior, so we sort of cheated a little bit, making it look from the outside like there was an interior with a minifigure peeking out, even though it was impossible to add a real interior. We used rounded off battlements once again on top, and then did the exact same for the second tower. And now these two towers are connected with Technic connectors to ensure that they actually hold on top of the cliff. And then in between this wall piece right there took us 4 hours to build, but afterwards you can always reward yourself with the detail work. For example, right there we decided to add a seagull that is shooed away by a soldier because it was bothering him from defending the fortress. Just little fun details. We then continue with the next wall sections, another 3 hours of work right there, which then connects the tower with the next building, which in this case also serves as part of the outer wall, and therefore is quite an important building as well on the corner, housing the captain's office filled with all sorts of letters stacked on his desk, and therefore he's also, as you can see, quite unhappy. The upper floor of the building is removable, now revealing a trapdoor. As soon as we open this trapdoor, you can see the beginning of a staircase leading down to the treasure chamber I was also talking about earlier in this video. Next is a small wall section that connects this building with another outer building, therefore also the thicker walls for stability. Since this is an outer building, it is also used as a defensive structure, including a watchtower with cannons, and roof once again is built in the exact same style as the adjacent building, because that always is important to have this homogeneous look for the entire fortress. And inside the rest of the building is a bit of a quieter space with a smaller living room right there. With the entire outer section of the fortress now finished, we can focus on the interior. And this part is now so satisfying. Just take a look at how perfectly this angled wall piece right there fits into the cut plates, and I tell you, as soon as we finished this part of the interior, we had to remove and place this part of the wall back into the fortress multiple times because it was so satisfying. On top, then our cannons as another line of defense within the fortress. We also added some greenery and the first palm tree right there, just a touch of green. We were quite careful in this case not to overdo it because we still have so much vegetation on the outside, and therefore this is important for the overall contrast. Here you can see the first soldiers being lined up, although someone is missing who is currently running towards the rest of the crew because he overslept and is a bit too late. Connecting to the spiral staircase, we now add the church inside the fortress. The interior, although isn't very exciting, I honestly didn't want to waste any minifigures inside because, well, in the end, they simply aren't visible. The interesting part is the upper section of the church because in this case I added a dome instead of the usual spire, fitting the colonial style. And also I recently developed this working bell for my other church in the Lego City, and therefore I honestly had to reuse this mechanism once again inside the fortress. Behind the church we decided to add a small cemetery that also works quite well color-wise because it once again adds a bit of contrast, although we might refine it with some cut plates to give it a bit of a softer look. This part is once again fenced off simply to highlight the different areas within the fortress. And then on the other side of the church, some soldiers are currently having a break, enjoying a few bottles of rum, and one soldier even passed out, created by using a modified brick with a stud, and then the head is simply placed on top, simulating a sleeping minifigure. Bit of cheating building technique wise right there. In the alley between the church and the other buildings, 3 chained pirates are being led down to the dungeon where the card playing skeletons are, if you remember that from earlier from this episode. And then we're nearly finished with the interior at this point. I only needed to add a touch of greenery on the inside, but not overdoing it at all, as I said earlier, because of the contrast towards the rest of the vegetation on the outside of the fortress. The outside of the fortress is now also where we're going to continue with the greenery, first of all with a new building technique I developed for palm trees. I always had issues with the palm trees disconnecting and falling out of place once again, so I now decided to add bars to the inside, which then can be placed inside a brick modified because they have these hollow studs. And now this is hopefully the one and only building techniques, so these palm trees finally stay in place and don't constantly fall off. The rest of the transition between the cliff and the wall is simply covered up with a few more of these bamboo leaves and then 2 more palm trees. Not too much greenery on the outside because we want to have the facade also visible of the fortress and not completely hide it behind palm trees. And now this is the very first time you can get a look of these 4 modules we've now finally completed. Highly detailed, but at the same time the overall picture isn't overcrowded, which is always the most important part. This module right there, now placing everything back into place to the rest of the mock, weighs about 10 kilos by now, I think. This is extremely heavy, of course, also with the caves we've added on the backside of the modules, which, as you might notice right now, can't be seen in this current position of the pirate mock. Therefore, I'm going to extend the entire mock, quadruple it in size, and then move it to another place in future. Therefore, we've also prepared these little cutouts with the caves that obviously at the moment can't be seen, but this project is going to be so much bigger, I don't think you have any idea. Now quickly adding the walls back in place and these 2 last remaining empty base plates in this area right there. This is what everything now looks like. And talking about the space issues we have, well, as you can see right there at the moment, this is the only way I can reach the pirate mock from the other side. I have to climb up on this railing of the staircase, and this of course isn't at all a long-term solution, so you're going to understand that I'm going to replace the pirate mock to a completely different spot in future. Which of course also means that at this point we really need to make plans on what the finished layout is going to look like, so we have an idea on what the next modules are going to look like. And this is the start of the next part, this giant fork machine right there, because this will be the heart of the Pirate World's next module, the volcano. Since the entire thing is going to be an island, let's start off with the water surface. First of all, we've prepped the foundation so the transition blends smoothly into the water, and then we've already laid down the first few thousand trans light blue tiles. The transition once again is made by using cut plates, so we have darker, wetter sand layer at the bottom, followed by a lighter sand tone. Then we added some greenery because for the lower part of this island, I mean, it's going to resemble a jungle since we're somewhere in the Caribbean. Once we got to this stage of the build, we had to figure out how to install the fog machine. The initial idea was to put it somewhere inside the volcano, but thankfully we decided against and completely rethought the entire concept. Here's now our new solution. We installed a drainage pipe system that I got from a hardware store that fits perfectly inside these arches, as you can see. And right now it's still a bit wobbly, but once we add the entire support structure and it's in place, then it's going to stabilize itself. That's also important since there will be quite a lot of pressure as soon as we hook up the fog machine to the entire pipe layout. As for the rocks, we didn't go completely overboard regarding the building techniques, but in this case this was in fact intentional to avoid any cracks where fog might escape at random spots from the volcano. We've then mapped out the future lava flows, which we've now programmed using DMX LED lights. Martin did an awesome job once again with all the lighting. Above that, we've now decided to use the net building technique, because that was the perfect opportunity to get this little space underneath the brick-built lava flow. Originally, we've planned to fold up the nets backwards to keep it Lego legal in some sort, but let's be real, nobody wants to deal with that, and therefore we simply decided to cut off the axis, which allowed us now to add these customized flexible lava flows right on top of the LED strips. And with that being done, I'd say let's fire up the LED strip and just take a look at how great it looks having the light refract through the 3 different layers of translucent bricks. You can really feel the lava making its way down the slope if you stand in front of the MOC. But I tell you, just wait for the fog as soon as we add that as well. Before we move on to the fog machine and the eruptions though, we need to add some vegetation and storytelling. The vegetation is done in the same style as on the other island to maintain consistency, and of course, jungle palms are a must. Since we are somewhere in the Caribbean, they really bring the scene to life. However, the trees are super unstable and keep falling over during the build, something I've dealt with on all the other palm trees as well we've added so far. And I tell you, I'm honestly really tempted to just glue them together and have that thing done. Here's the first look at the overgrown island, but of course the storytelling is still missing, so let's start on the right side of the island where some indigenous people are hanging out by a cozy campfire, completely unaware of the impending volcanic eruption. In the nearby bay, there are other islanders paddling in a canoe. We've got monkeys stealing bananas, food hanging up to dry, and seagulls also trying to steal that food. Simply lots of fun little details and storytelling. We've built another of these little nostalgic statues you could find back in the days in the old Lego Pirate sets. Just couldn't leave that out. Of course, there's plenty of other action happening as well on the other side of the island, like these 2 guys trying to catch a seagull. 2 treasure hunters, also completely unaware of the danger they are in. We've also got a stranded pirate who's been reduced to bones, with seagulls currently picking at his skeleton. 1 islander even trying to catch one of the seagulls with a net, so the island is packed with action. We didn't want to overload the scene, however, so the last one for now is these sea turtles currently hatching right at the beach. Now onto the mechanism. On the backside of the volcano we've prepared this hole, you could also see earlier, for attaching the pipe, which then transports the fog. Of course, this is just a prototype for now, and we'll make it a bit more professional later on, but the fog machine now fills up this box with fog, and from there we can now control the amount of fog that enters the volcano. As the eruption now starts, first of all, only the lava flow is visible at the top of the volcano. We made it bright enough so you can actually see it during the day. The real highlight though is, of course, the nighttime eruption. Just wait a second for that. And now, when the eruption happens, it could look something like this. Maybe even with sound effects. We still need to decide how much sound we actually want to add to the experience, because at the end of the day it's just noise, but I still think it could add something to the overall vibe of the volcanic eruption. I'll also show you the natural noise level the whole setup makes in just a second with all the equipment running, the fog machine, fan and so on. It's actually already quite loud. We'll also try a bigger test of the eruption in just a second, but first of all, in the close-up you can see that right here. The net building technique I mentioned earlier has such an awesome effect when the fog gets pressed underneath the nets and then flows out through the lava, which is something we didn't plan but turned out even better than we initially expected. Here you can now see why it's actually so important to control the amount of fog for the volcanic eruption so it looks natural. Less fog simply works much better because blasting it full on out doesn't look quite right. The lower fog setting worked much better. Another problem with simply blasting it all out is that after 20 seconds the entire room fills up with so much fog you can't see anything else, although I have to say that the close-up looks like something straight out of Mordor, which is super cool. The only problem is, while it looks great, the rest of the Lego room has completely disappeared behind thick layers of smoke. After a few eruptions, it's a total mess. I think by this point we had 5 or 6 eruptions already behind us, so it makes sense that at some point it starts getting out of hand. What I haven't shown you yet is how it looks at night, and therefore we tried to set up a continuous mode with just a light cloud of fog. This could now actually run for 10 minutes, maybe even half an hour, because the small amount of fog dissipates a few seconds after leaving the volcano, but still the lights make it look as if there's quite a lot actually coming out. So this is probably the best solution for a continuous volcanic eruption. The bigger eruptions, of course, still look so much more impressive, and the way the fog glows red under the lights, I don't know, it's probably one of my favorite mocks we've built so far, simply because of the fog and the lights for the lava flow we've added. This is what the volcano looks like disassembled into the different modules, which is important because next up it's finally time to combine the volcano with the rest of the existing pirate world, and as I've promised you at the beginning of the video, it's time to expand the layout one last time and combine everything together. The volcano we've just finished building, a ton of new water base plates of course to blend everything together, the island we started with at the beginning of the video, and now let's focus on the harbor. Using hinges and cut plates, we've now created a super smooth connection between the harbor wall and the mainland. I mean, just take a moment to admire how satisfying that transition really is. Of course, we've also added wooden bollards in the water, so ships don't crash straight into the harbor wall, because that would definitely cause some serious damage and most likely result in a sunken ship. For the houses, starting at the back of the mainland, for the first time we're actually building out the rear side as well, because unlike the typical Lego City builds I make, where I just build facades, these houses are fully enclosed structures finished from both sides. For instance, the sandy green building right there at the back nicely contrasts the more colorful front side. We've also right away added some storytelling details. In one corner, someone's doing the laundry. We've also got some creative part usage right there. Minifigure hands serve as clothespins, for example. To the left of the housing block is a church, which was quite tricky to fit in at the right angle. And in front of the church, we've arguably the most important building of the harbor, a tavern. Like always, it's fully built out, but in this case, space inside was pretty tight, and to compensate, we therefore spilled most of the action outside, where people are drinking, having a good time, and also one guy right there has clearly been drinking a bit too much. There's also a working fountain with a proper shaft and bucket in front of the harbor. We've then also added a small market square with stalls, tons of minifigures to bring the scene to life, cranes loading barrels onto ships, and in the other corner, captured pirates are being hauled in nets. We've also scattered fun little details and stories throughout the entire marketplace, so you can really spend several minutes looking at this little section of the mock. Moving up the path to the fortress, you'll see soldiers marching along, and other than that, we've added a ton of vegetation. This is especially important to add a bit of breathing room, because otherwise at some point the model gets a bit too cramped. Now let's head on to the peninsula at the front, where we're now setting up a lighthouse. But before that, we've added another story. Workers are building a ship, and you can see 2 guys working on the sails, which leads to the big surprise of today's update, motorized features, which I'll explain more in detail later on. because this isn't the only motorized thing we've added. The lighthouse is now designed to match the fortress with, and this is the most important thing of course, a functional signal fire at the top, achieved by adding flickering LEDs inside the fire. Below there's a wooden pier where fishermen are at work. We've used quite a clever trick where you can simply attach the fishing line underneath the flat tile, adding tension to the string. On one side we've added a fish, and on the other side, well, this is a bit of a tougher catch. The other fisherman has apparently just caught a shark. Moving on from all these smaller details onto quite a big detail actually, this giant ship. And this fits so perfectly into that corner right there. Since this ship is currently anchored, we of course didn't add any sails, but on the other side we attached a ton of strings and also connected it to the harbor using a wooden plank. This simply makes it feel more integrated with the mainland rather than just being a standalone ship. Right there you can also see this one guy rolling a barrel on board. Now, this isn't the only ship we've added. You can see this giant cutout right in the center of the water surface, and this is for the ship we built much earlier in today's video, which we've in the meantime upgraded as well, by the way. But taking a look at the ship with the waves we've added, I think it looks so much better than just placing it onto an empty water base plate. We've then also added some smaller boats as well, just to add some sort of action to the water surface. And then in the corner of the model, one fun scene shows two pirates on a raft currently being attacked by tentacles rising out of the water. A hint at maybe a kraken. We didn't show the full creature though, which actually works better as it leaves more to the imagination. As you can see right there, the tentacles are built with ball joints, so they're flexible and look natural, and from a distance you can even see the tiny gaps in between the pieces, so it works perfectly. Now for the full picture. In the corner there are the kraken tentacles, and here's the entire MOC. At the corner, the original island that started off the entire project at the beginning of the video. In the center there's the upgraded pirate ship. We've added all these gold touches, especially if you compare it to the first version, which you can see right there. I think the newer one looks so much cleaner and more fitting to the rest of the vibe of the entire world. Then of course, my personal highlight, the volcano as it erupts. I think this is just such a unique feature. The only problem we have at the moment is that we definitely need to install some sort of ventilation, because after some time, as you know by now, the entire room is just filled with smoke, and therefore we need to work something out to be able to have the volcano erupt more often. And now, another thing I promised you at the beginning of the video. We've added a ton of motion throughout the entire MOC. For example, the two guys on top of the cliff fighting, then musicians in the center of the already busy market square, the guy peeking out of the barrel, one of my favorite little highlights, and of course, you guys know that scene by now, these two guys working on the boat. The way we've integrated these little scenes is actually more complicated than you might think, because you need to be able to take out an entire chunk of the harbor in order to be able to work on and repair the mechanism should it fail at some point, and therefore we had to work out the transitions so it doesn't destroy the seamless vibe of the rest of the MOC. But I think it worked out great in this case, and what I find even better is the guy peeking out of the barrel, because you have no idea of seeing where exactly this chunk can be taken out of the cliffside. And there you can also see the customized motor. We 3D printed it ourselves. This is the only part that's actually not Lego. The rest of the mechanism, you can see that right there, is fully built out of Lego parts. The only reason we chose not to use original Lego motors is because of the noise, but it would theoretically work with a Lego motor as well. So this then slowly but surely completes the pirate project, but I have to say that at some point I definitely want to continue building it, but for now I need to save up some more money, because the total budget of this project so far, as it stands, was about 30,000 euros, so I think like 33,000 US dollars or something. So quite an expensive project even for me, but I think money that's definitely well spent. So with that being said, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this project as much as I did, and you're ready for the upcoming even crazier Lego models I want to build.